Object permanence is the understanding that objects continue to exist even when you can't see them. When we're very young babies, we don't understand this, but it's something we learn as we grow older. Or do we? I mean, of course we understand conceptually that things also exist when we're not looking at them, but often it's kind of knowing without knowing, where we don't fully get it on an emotional level. An example of this is that meat eaters often aren't emotionally affected by atrocities happening in slaughterhouses that are out of sight, despite having been told that terrible things are happening. And it may be why we typically care a lot if we see someone in need right in front of us, while if someone's life in another country can be saved through charity, well, that doesn't make us feel the same sense of urgency. As vegans, we often focus on our personal lives and try to minimize the harm caused to other sentient beings by changing our purchasing behavior, and that is of course important. But in this video, I will focus on something else that is also important, namely the good we can do and the harm we can prevent through charity. The difference we can make through charity is even larger than the difference made by our lifestyles, probably many times as large if we donate considerable amounts to charities effectively addressing important causes. And I don't say that to minimize the importance of our lifestyles, but rather to underline the importance of charitable giving. There are several biases that affect our thinking when it comes to charitable giving. One of these biases is sometimes called scope insensitivity. Scope insensitivity occurs when a value we assign a problem doesn't correspond appropriately with its size. In a famous study, 3 groups of participants were asked how much they'd pay to save birds from drowning in oil ponds. Group A were asked how much they'd pay to save 2,000 birds. Group B and C were asked the same question, but with the number of birds instead being 20,000 and 200,000. On average, participants in Group A were willing to pay $80, while the ones in Group B were willing to pay $78, and the ones in Group C were willing to pay $88. So basically, the number of birds that would be helped was multiplied by 100, but the amount of money people said they'd be willing to pay remained about the same. When discussing this, AI theorist and writer Eliza Yudkowsky wrote the following: "People visualize a single exhausted bird, its feathers soaked in black oil, unable to escape. This image, or prototype, calls forth some level of emotional arousal that is primarily responsible for the willingness to pay. And the image is the same in all cases. As for scope, it gets tossed out the window. No human can visualize 2,000 birds at once, let alone 200,000. Imagine one animal in pain. Even with one animal, we don't understand the urgency like we would if we were the ones in pain, but we are able to generate a fairly clear mental image. But try now not to imagine one animal in pain, but 100,000. After that, try to imagine 1 billion animals. The last number is vastly higher than the second. However, it's difficult for us to have a clear idea of what the magnitude of that difference is. As a result of this, we often fail to assess properly what we should do when large numbers of individuals are affected. This is a bias that we all have, and even when we're aware of it, we still can't visualize 1 billion animals. Our brains simply haven't evolved to cope with numbers like this. Several other studies have shown that we suffer from scope insensitivity. In one study, some participants were told that $300,000 was needed to save the life of one child by providing an expensive treatment. Meanwhile, other participants were told that this same sum of money could be used to save 8 children. So how much more were participants willing to give when they could save 8 times as many children per dollar? Well, actually, they were willing to give less. I guess when we're told about one child, our empathy is focused on that one child, while when we're told about several children, it feels more like a statistic. But if you got sick and needed life-saving treatment, it wouldn't matter to you whether you were the only sick person or 1 out of 1,000. It would still be just as important that your life was saved. Numbers matter because individuals matter. Helping individuals is why we're giving in the first place. And while some people might feel that it's a bit cold to be focused on numbers, it's what we need to do if we want to strategically intervene in the best way we can. What these so-called numbers are is individual human and non-human animals. Each number is an individual, so to not be concerned with numbers is to not be concerned with the individual. Just think about how big the difference is between 1,000 people being helped and 1,001 people being helped if you are number 1,001. Perhaps we'll never be able to fully empathise with every human and non-human on Earth, but we can try to act in a more similar way to the way we would have acted if we did. And perhaps the way to do that is to be a bit more like this guy. Unfortunately, we often don't try that hard to be effective. It's been estimated that around 97% of philanthropic funding in the US is focused on helping humans. The remaining 3% is distributed to organisations that focus on animals and the environment. Even among the donations directed towards animals, it seems that a clear majority is going towards animal shelters, even though the amount of animals in shelters is only a small fraction of the animals that need our help. Predicting which charities do the most good is extremely complicated, and no measure of effectiveness is perfect. That being said, one source of guidance is Animal Charity Evaluators, or ACE. Honestly, I don't know of anyone else who has spent more time and effort evaluating the effectiveness of various animal charities. In their comprehensive reviews, they consider multiple factors, including strategy, track record, a room for more funding, cost effectiveness, and more. Obviously, the evaluation process used by ACE isn't perfect. There is no perfect way to evaluate effectiveness. And what the most effective giving opportunities are is going to change over time. So ACE regularly update their recommended charities based on changes in opportunities and based on new evidence that they gather. ACE publishes a list of their top recommended charities each year. There are a variety of charities on the current list focusing on different ways we can help non-human animals. For example, one of them, the Good Food Institute, focuses on developing and promoting animal meat alternatives, including lab-grown meat. And while this might come as a surprise to some people, this year one of their top recommended charities is Wild Animal Initiative. Wild Animal Initiative conducts research on how to help wild animals, and aims to foster interest in the scientific community towards wild animal welfare. While this kind of work is not guaranteed to give great results, and the results down the line may be hard to measure, ACE's analysis suggests that Wild Animal Initiative should be on this list because, among other reasons, wild animal suffering is a very underprioritised area. Several of ACE's top charities work on corporate outreach, trying to get companies to improve welfare standards. There are organisations that have a track record of succeeding with this strategy in the past, partly due to companies knowing that they will be faced with bad PR if they don't comply. This gets us into another discussion though, the debate between welfarism and abolitionism. So to give you an insight into my own background, here's an excerpt from a video that I made in 2019.
Yes, some people are going to call you an extremist because you're against the needless suffering and death of animals all the time. Well, if that's what makes you an extremist, be an extremist. Because it's okay to hold an absolutist view when it comes to needless suffering and death. When it comes to the abuse of children, I'm an absolutist. Call me an extremist because I'm against it all the time. When it comes to the rape of women or men, I'm an extremist because I'm against it all the time. So when it comes to needless suffering of animals, when it comes to turning them into objects for our selfish desires, call me an extremist because I'm against it all the time. So welcome to your first therapy session. I assure you I am extremely experienced within this subject area. So tell me, how long have you been beating your wife?
Since the start, really. I've always done it. I've always had this anger inside of me.
Right, and in the last week, how often have you beaten your wife?
Every day. Every single day.
Piece of shit.
What?
What? Okay, so I'm going to give you a table. Now, this is essentially a timetable. So currently you are beating your wife every single day of the week. What I would like you to do is start beating her 3 times a week. So Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, you beat your wife. The rest of the days of the week, you don't beat your wife.
Obviously, I'm still against the unnecessary torture of animals all the time. So I'm still technically an extremist in the eyes of many. While I still maintain this viewpoint, I have, over time, started to see more and more value in also pushing for more incremental change. Not because I'm giving up on my wish for the abolition of animal farms and slaughterhouses, but because it seems that incremental change may be the most effective way to get there. Some vegans argue that welfare reform might be counterproductive by encouraging people to think that animal farming is humane and thus making them more likely to buy more animal products. And to be fair, I often hear people saying that they only buy from humane sources, despite the fact that the overwhelming majority of animal products comes from factory farms and inhumane fishing practices. It's clear that the very idea of humane animal products is already being used as an excuse to continue supporting practices that are anything but humane. And it's conceivable that welfarism reinforces the notion that animals are mere objects to be used, and hence that animal farms and slaughterhouses are a permanent feature of our societies. However, it's important to look at both sides of the argument. When a welfare reform happens, people see that their culture includes some concern for farmed animals, which can help people develop stronger cultural identification with that concern, enabling people to feel more outrage when they find that animals are still suffering tremendously, even in improved or humane farms and slaughterhouses. And there are some studies suggesting that people exposed to information about welfare reform are more likely to say that they want to reduce their consumption of animal products. And besides, welfare reform often increases the costs of animal farming, which also reduces consumption. And last but not least, welfare reform can make a very important difference to the many animals that are directly affected. Keeping hens trapped in cages where they haven't even got the space to lift up their wings is worse than keeping hens in barns where they at least have the space to move around. Of course, I would rather the animal hadn't been bred and exploited at all. But whenever their lives can be made less miserable, I think that matters a lot. After all, it would matter a lot to me if I was them. The way for a movement to achieve their goals varies from situation to situation, but sometimes building coalitions and making incremental changes can be an important component of the strategy. As an example, the British government abolished the transatlantic slave trade in 1807, and then in 1833 went on to abolish slavery altogether. Presumably, many of the people who lobbied towards abolishing the transatlantic slave trade thought slavery was outrageous and wanted it banned altogether. But that doesn't mean that abolishing the transatlantic slave trade wasn't worth fighting for. It helped many people and laid the groundwork for future progress. As to organisations lobbying for welfare reform, it's hard to calculate exactly how effective they are, but that hasn't stopped some people from trying. Here's an excerpt from an article by the Open Philanthropy Project, where they write about the effectiveness of past campaigns against the caging of hens. If we assume, fairly arbitrarily, that these campaigns brought about cage-free reforms about 5 years earlier than they would have occurred otherwise, then these campaigns are likely to spare about 300 million total hens 1 year of cage confinement. We estimate that about $2.5 million has been spent in total on corporate cage-free campaigns, suggesting that these campaigns have likely spared about 120 hens 1 year of battery cage confinement per dollar spent. If we were to include the funding spent to pass Proposition 2 in California in 2008, which banned battery cages in the state and may have been necessary to enable the later corporate campaigns, the estimate would drop to something more like 20 hens spared a year in battery cages per dollar spent. Now, the article itself states a bit further down that we do not have much confidence in the accuracy of these estimates, so it's probably best to take estimates like this with several grains of salt. Nonetheless, it looks to me like effective animal charities can often do a lot for the money they get. If I was to make a recommendation for effective giving to reduce animal suffering, I would probably suggest going to ACE and reading the reports of their top charities. But if you don't want to do that, another great option is to give to the EA Animal Welfare Fund. With full transparency, the fund gives out grants to various effective charities working to reduce animal suffering. The people who manage this fund have thought extensively and deeply about effectiveness. And by being organised the way they are able to be nimble and opportunistic when good funding opportunities arrive. And also, since they distribute between different kinds of charities, donating to them is an easy way to avoid putting all of your tofu in one basket. And if this approach appeals to you, perhaps you'd be interested in effective altruism more generally. Effective altruism can be described as both a movement and a philosophy that advocates using evidence and reasoning to determine the most effective ways to help others with our resources. Now, that might not sound so original, but when people try really hard to figure out where the opportunities to do the most good can be found, the results can often be eye-opening. Some people in the effective altruism community are focused on animals, while others are more focused on other cause areas. Everything from fighting malaria to trying to reduce the risk of catastrophic future events. Some people in the movement have taken the Giving What We Can pledge, where they commit themselves to donating at least 10% of their income to effective charities. Anyway, that's enough about effective altruism for now, but I have a playlist in my pinned comment for those of you who want to learn more. If you think this video had an important message, then you can help by sharing it on social media and with friends. I hope you all have a fantastic Christmas, and if you want to celebrate this time of the year by helping animals, then perhaps consider leaving animal products off your plate and donating to an effective animal charity. I'll leave links to the websites of both Animal Charity Evaluators and the EA Animal Welfare Fund in the description box of this video for those of you who want to learn more or donate. I'll also post links to some additional reading for those of you who are particularly interested in this topic. And if you want to be notified about new content, then hit the bell icon. With that said, thanks for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.